Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us this afternoon, or morning or evening, wherever you are. We have attendees today from across the globe, and welcome to the latest in Fathom's webinar series, Questions to Ask Your Flood Modelers. My name is Tim Hodkinson. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer at Fathom and your host for this event. The first webinar in this series was way back in October of last year when we launched version 3 of our global flood map. This was followed in November 2022 by a second webinar on our climate dynamics framework, and more recently by sessions covering the use cases for our global flood map in the insurance sector, engineering sector, and in financial markets. All of those webinars are available to view on our website, and I'd encourage you to do so if you didn't catch them the first time round. For this webinar, we thought we would take a slightly different approach, inspired by input from you, our audience. We're often asked a common set of questions by customers' insurance, financial services, engineering, international aid, and other sectors, also by regulators and journalists, and of course by our colleagues in the academic community. These questions include broad areas such as how flood models are made, where do we get the input data to those models, and indeed how good is that input data? And what does the output of those models mean in terms of what quality is it? How should it be used? And just as importantly, how should it not be used? And what uncertainty bounds should be placed on it and its use? So we've collected together some of the most frequently asked questions here, and in posing those, I'll try to do my best in acting as an objective interlocutor with our experts. Of course, if you have any further questions, please contribute to the discussion by submitting them via the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom screen. You'll also see in the Zoom chat some links to our website, our LinkedIn account, which you're very welcome to follow, and a download link to a PDF that accompanies this webinar. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our august panel of experts, Dr. Natalie Lord, Tom Collins, and Dr. Chris Sampson, and ask them to briefly introduce themselves. Nat, if you'd go first, please.
Thanks, Tim. Hi, everyone. So I'm Dr. Natalie Lord, as Tim said. I did my PhD at the University of Bristol quite a few years ago now, and for that I was using climate models to look at future changes in climate and how they might impact disposal of radioactive waste materials. And I've also completed a number of other postdoctoral research projects, also at the University of Bristol, looking at things like the representation of tropical cyclones and climate models of different horizontal resolution, and then also future changes and impacts of extreme events over the next century. And at Fathom, where I've been for 2 years, a couple of days ago, I'm senior climate change expert. So I use climate model data and observational data to assess things like extreme precipitation and tropical cyclones and how they might change in the future, and then how we can incorporate these changes and data sets into our models, and then also what impacts they might have on future flood hazard.
Thanks, Nat. Chris, could you go next, please?
Thanks, Tim. Hello, folks. So my name is Chris Sampson. I am one of the founders here at Fathom. My research background and my PhD was focused on the architecture and automation of large-scale hydraulic models. So the tool sets that we use here as the foundation for most of the modeling that we do. That work really was inspired in many ways by the big floods in Thailand in 2011, as we were starting to try and work out how we might build models in those parts of the world that don't have an awful lot of data and that you can't do anything locally. And from that, the idea of a global framework came, and I suppose out of that was really where the business came from. So that's me.
And Tom, if you could say a few words, please.
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. My name's Tom Collins. I've been working with Fathom for a little over a year now as a developer in their coastal team, working on a whole range of projects from Global 3 to the coastal change factors. Before that, I studied at the University of Southampton, studying oceanography and coastal engineering. And currently I'm focused on, my main project is a project with our partner RIASC, building a hydrodynamic model of the whole US to run a catalogue of synthetic hurricanes.
Thanks, everyone. So we've got a great panel of experts covering a broad range of the sciences that Fathom touched today. Let's dive straight into the first question. If you could pick only one component of a flood model to get right, what would it be? Chris, could you lead on that, please?
Sure. Well, it's a fairly fundamental truth that water flows downhill, and therefore, if we could only choose one piece of data to really focus on, it would have to be the terrain data on which the model's built. And that's been an area of real progress, I guess, over the last 3 or 4 years in particular. In local models, you tend to have quite high quality data to work with, LiDAR being the benchmark, and that's something that those of us who work a lot in the UK or the US, for example, will be quite familiar with. But globally, for the best part of 20 years, we have been working with NASA's shuttle radar topography mission data, which fundamentally limited, I guess, the skill that we could build models with globally. A couple of years ago, the European Space Agency changed this with the release of the Tandem X data by Copernicus. And that has fundamentally, I think, changed what we can do at the global scale. So our model skill has improved really significantly across the planet. And this is really exciting because I guess the ceiling to model skill has moved significantly. There's an awful lot of work to do on top of that. You have to correct a lot of the artifacts that satellite-based data have within them. And there's a lot of work that's being done at the moment with machine learning techniques that take us from a surface model, as seen by the radar instruments, to a terrain model, which is what you need for flood model, because you need to route water over the surface of the earth, not over the tops of trees and over the tops of buildings. And so I suppose the key point here is that when we look at terrain models for flooding, the thing that we really focus on is the vertical accuracy of those terrain models rather than necessarily the horizontal precision. And most of the research work that we do is in trying to improve that vertical accuracy of the terrain data.
Thanks, Chris. The most commonly highlighted feature of a flood model is, of course, its horizontal precision or spatial resolution. To what extent is a more precise model a more accurate one?
Well, I suppose, yeah, I suppose this is the point here. So we have long tried to make the point, both as a research group and I suppose more recently as a business, that resolution without context is fairly meaningless. So if you increase the resolution of the model, you increase the precision of the model, this implies accuracy to the user. A very, very high resolution picture, you kind of going to assume that picture is accurate. However, this inference is usually false unless the rest of the model is commensurate with the quality, with the precision of your terrain data. And I guess to give an example, I mean, the key point is that other model components may be limiting. So the precision of the model is not the limiting factor on the accuracy. It might be your knowledge of urban drainage systems in urban areas, or it might be uncertainty around what the 1 in 100 year flow actually is. I mean, typically you may have a 30% uncertainty bound around a 1 in 100 year flow on a river that's well gauged. And so in ungauged regions, your uncertainty is going to be even larger than that. And so you have to ask the question, well, if I'm that uncertain about how much water is supposed to be in the domain for a given flood event, is there any reason to model at incredibly high resolution, or am I just giving users a false sense of security in the data that results from the model? A lot of literature has looked at this and typically starts to see diminishing returns on model skill once the resolution gets beyond 40 or 50 meters. So that's, I think, a really interesting finding because it implies that a race for resolution is not necessarily the best use that we can make of computational expense. And this is ultimately a really important point in this discussion as well, because when you double the resolution of a hydraulic model, you increase the computational cost by something like an order of magnitude. One cell becomes 4 cells, and the time step of the model has to halve. So you have to run twice as many time steps over 4 times as many cells. And so you have to ask, well, is this the best use of the computational power that I have at my disposal? I suppose the final point I'm going to make on this as well is that once you're getting down to sort of 10-meter or 5-meter resolution models, which you may want to run in fine urban areas, you probably don't actually want to use a digital terrain model, because the buildings themselves become very influential in terms of the hydraulics of what's going on. So actually you have to start to look again at the terrain model that you're using, and perhaps you want to put the buildings back into it, but you still need to remove the vegetation, because water will flow around the buildings. But if you're in a vegetated area, such as trees, the water will still flow around the trees. And so it becomes pretty complex actually to build those kinds of terrain models at scale. And so I suppose it's a pretty complicated thing to do. And therefore, yeah, the takeaway is that resolution without context is pretty meaningless. You need to know what else is going on in the model before you trust the precision.
Thanks, Chris. We've had a question in from the audience from Kevin McDonald, which is pertinent to this particular subject. And the question is, does your forest and building bias predictor use OpenStreetMap? And if so, to what extent?
So OpenStreetMap data is a part of the machine learning algorithm. Yeah, it's one of the predictors. So in urban areas, clearly that's very useful. Building footprints are a key predictor of urban correction, but OSM data and building footprints don't on their own tell you anything about the vertical threat, so they have to be used in conjunction with other data. It is just one of several predictors that go into the machine learning algorithms that correct elevations in urban areas, and there's a significant amount of uncertainty within it. We think that, and the publications and the testing that we've done have shown that the corrections that we're able to perform over Copernicus data take us about halfway between what we were able to achieve with SRTM data and a local LiDAR bare earth model. So it's a really significant improvement, but there is still error there, and there are still improvements to be made in the future.
Thanks. But surely, you can't represent small river channels with a 30-meter grid. And are these not that important then?
They are important, and you can represent them, because a lot of models, not just our own, but a lot of models use and represent processes that sit beneath the grid scale of the model. We call these subgrid processes in our modeling frameworks. And effectively what you're doing is you're parameterizing river flows for channels that sit below the grid scale. And actually, even if you were to represent larger channels than say 30 meters in your example directly on the grid, it would mean your river would have to be either 30 meters wide or 60 meters wide or 90 meters wide. Those are pretty big steps. And rivers are hugely important, even small ones, when it comes to flooding, because they convey the bulk of flows across land. This is a simple result of the fact that friction is so dominant in very shallow floodplain flows, but river channels are deep and the effects of friction are significantly reduced, which means that water velocities are significantly higher than on the floodplain. And so most of the water is conveyed through that channel network. You can think of them as sort of like the veins and arteries of the system. And therefore it's essential that you represent these. You want to represent them explicitly where you know where those rivers are and those streams are, and then potentially parameterize them where you have less fine information about channels, because they are so important. I think the final point to make there is that they're difficult to observe. So you can observe where a river is fairly easily. If you can't see it, you can imply it from the elevation data. But what you can't observe is how deep these rivers are. There is no global, anyway, remotely sensed solution that lets you see the depth of a river. And therefore, what you need to do is you need to look at how the framework is built and attempt to basically use the flow estimates that you're using to self-calibrate the river channels in terms of their depths, such that effectively the size of your modelled rivers are appropriate for the modelled estimates of flow. That's one of the kind of critical points in building a behavioural model at scale.
Thanks, Chris. But what about other types of flooding, like surface water or coastal floods? Do you need to make different considerations when modelling these? Who'd like to take that question?
Yeah, no, I'm happy to chat about that. Definitely. Everything Chris has already mentioned is really important, but the way that we simulate, the way that we simulate flow of water over the land is still exactly the same in both those instances for coastal and pluvial flooding. But we need a more tailored approach to how we create the boundary conditions for these floods. In terms of coastal, I mean, that's where my expertise lies. Creating the global boundary conditions was something that was new for us for Global 3. So a lot of time and effort went in to defining these. We opted for using a regional frequency analysis, or RFA approach, combining observational and modelled data. The RFA approach, it can be considered as a space for time approach, meaning that instead of using fewer, longer, complete records to assess exceedance thresholds, we use more shorter records to obtain robust parameter estimations. And it comes with 3 key advantages using the RFA. As a consequence of the regionalization process, number 1, we can output the extreme sea level exceedance probabilities at a much higher resolution than the input data. As tide gauges, they can often be quite sparse, and even model output data from global tide surge models that we use in all the places where we haven't got tide gauge data, that can be quite coarse as well. Secondly, by using all of the data across a region, we can get better characterization of rare extreme events such as tropical cyclones, which are generally undersampled in our short, incomplete historical records. And thirdly, we utilize gauges with short, incomplete records in our estimations of regional extreme sea levels, thus making use of all of the available data that is available. One of the big things of characterizing exceedance probabilities is that you need long records typically. So by pooling the data into regional groups, we can use these short records and still retain the maximum amount of data possible.
Thanks, Tom. Now, neither of you have mentioned climate change yet. So where does climate change come into all of this? I guess it's a question for both you, Nat, and you, Tom, this one.
Yeah, definitely. So climate change is obviously really important and increasingly so, and that is now starting to be recognised in different kind of sectors, which is great. But so on the climate change of things, we find that climate is expected to affect the kind of 3 main flood perils quite differently. So on the pluvial side of things, we're confident that as the climate warms, extreme precipitation events in many regions will become more intense and more frequent in the future. And we can see the signal quite clearly in climate models that we can use to kind of assess this. And this is also in line with our kind of understanding of basic physics, where a warmer atmosphere is able to hold more water moisture, and then that obviously kind of falls as precipitation at some point. And so the more intense rainfall events that we're expected to see do quite consistently lead to increases in pluvial flooding in many regions. But interestingly, for fluvial flooding, there's quite a bit more uncertainty. So it might seem obvious that if extreme rainfall in climate models is projected to increase over much of the land surface, which is what we find, you might expect that actually fluvial floods would increase as well. You've got more rainfall falling on the land, moving into rivers, and therefore you'd expect an increase in fluvial floods. But that isn't actually what we see when we couple climate models to hydrological models. And actually in some regions, fluvial floods are projected to decrease, so not even see no change. They're actually expected to decrease. And the reason for this, it does vary by region, but it's mainly related to future changes with climate in other processes that are important for driving river floods. And these might include things like decreasing soil moisture and then also decreasing snowmelt, which may also occur at different times of the year to what we've seen in the historical period. And so that means that the extreme rainfall isn't the kind of key or main driver in some of these processes, or certainly at the return periods that we've kind of been looking at so far. And so it's really important when looking at climate change that you use appropriate models to assess these changes, and that includes using ensembles of models where possible as well. So all of these different climate and hydrological models are built in different ways. They're built by different institutions around the world. They might include different processes and components of the Earth system, and then parameterize different processes in different ways as well. And so they've all got biases and uncertainties associated with them. And obviously, we can compare and validate them to observations, but ultimately, we don't know, which well, it's impossible to say if one model is kind of, the gold standard of model is better than all the others. It varies a lot by region. It varies by what you're interested in, what your focus is. So we use ensembles of models at Fathom to try and help reduce some of the impacts of the biases that these models have. And it also allows us to understand some of the uncertainties in different parts of the climate change modelling framework, such as our projections of future rainfall and of fluvial flooding.
Just to jump in there on the coastal stuff, yeah, so with our coastal, the most recent Global 3 that we've produced, the coastal change factors, we used IPCC AR6 as our sea level rise projections. Again, yeah, like Nat said, it's really key that we were using an ensemble of models there, which is why we're using the AR6 projections rather than a single sea level rise projections. And it's also sort of pertinent to note that while climate change will impact other drivers of coastal flooding, such as sort of storminess, extreme waves, and tidal dynamics, there aren't these multi-model ensembles of future climate scenarios available yet. So quantifying the future change is actually quite difficult. And in general, in most areas, the changing sea levels will dominate any changes to future extreme sea levels. So we're not overly concerned at the moment at the lack of those drivers, however, in our model, but it is something that we're looking to integrate into the next future versions. Yeah.
Thanks both. Nat, you mentioned uncertainty several times, and it's easy to say, oh, it's so uncertain to avoid scrutiny, maybe, but what are we doing to enable model users to better understand uncertainty?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's often used by some groups to kind of push for not adopting any changes because they kind of say that there's a lot of uncertainty, but just because we don't know anything for certain doesn't mean we don't know things. So these models are still really useful, and they can give us useful information. I guess there's a few different sources of uncertainty. So one of the big ones is obviously future greenhouse gases and how they'll evolve in the future. We obviously can't predict what's going to happen. So often what's done is we have sets of scenarios which make different assumptions about future socioeconomic development. But there are multiple sets of these sets of scenarios which have been produced by different groups and for kind of different functions. So we have, for example, the RCP and SSP scenarios, which we used in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's assessment reports and are quite often used in kind of the climate research area. There's also the NGFS scenarios, which were designed to kind of help central banks assess the impacts of climate change on the economy and on financial systems. And so we've deliberately designed our Global 3 flood data to be flexible because it may be that people want to kind of look at the relative impacts of a world where, we reach zero net zero, for example, and we don't see a huge increase in temperature, but equally people may be interested in more of a worst case scenario situation where we have, 3.5, 4 degrees of warming and what impacts that might have. And so we've designed our flood hazard data so that we can produce global flood maps, hazard maps, of any future emissions scenario or time horizon or global warming level of interest. And that allows users to really start to assess some of the different impacts resulting from these different levels of global warming that might kind of materialize in the future, depending on how we as a globe decide to address climate change and reduce emissions. We've also mentioned a few times that there are uncertainties associated with the climate and hydrological and coastal models themselves. And so I've kind of mentioned that we use an ensemble where we can, rather than just using a single model. And so where we have used these ensembles, we've designed our modelling framework to take the uncertainties in these kind of different ensembles and then explicitly cascade them down through into the flood output. And then also we account for the uncertainty in the historical baseline period that each of the different perils uses kind of observational data for. And this means that the uncertainties are kind of accounted for. I mean, they're accounted for in different ways in the different perils, but it ultimately means that we can produce a distribution of future projections for each location and for each flood peril, rather than kind of a single view of how flood hazard might change in the future. And so we provide the median, which I guess is a kind of standard view that you might take for a future scenario, but we also produce a likely range around that. So that's based on the IPCC's definition of likely, which is the central 66% of a distribution as standard, but we can also provide other percentiles. But that kind of just means that rather than providing this single view that we, say this is how flood hazard in 2050 under SSP 58.5 will change, we provide kind of the likely range around that so that users have some understanding of the uncertainty that are included in those assumptions. But it's not possible to include all of the uncertainties in the hazard data in this way. And so later in the year, we'll produce some model metadata, which will also accompany our global 3 hazard data. And this is essentially a set of layers which will provide information about the kind of relative quality of the flood maps over space. So it'll be a numerical score. And for that, we're assessing things like gauge density in a region, the terrain data quality, which Chris has already touched on. And then for the climate model side of things, whether the models agree on the sign of change in extreme precipitation, for example, or not. And so that will mean that users can click on a specific location and then get an indication of the level of confidence we have in the flood data in that particular location, and then also how different components of the modelling framework are affecting that score. And so that should help users to kind of understand some of the uncertainties in the hazard data in the regions that they're interested in.
Yeah, if I could just jump in, thanks, Nat. I was given a really nice overview of the idea of providing metadata to users that, in a way, facilitates access to, I guess, our judgment as to how well the model is working in any given area, because obviously all models involve subjective choices in terms of their construction, and we have a pretty good view as we work with them day to day as to where they work better and where they don't work so well. And so the idea of metadata is to communicate our knowledge to the user around model certainty. We've had a question come in that asks about flood defences, and these are obviously one of the biggest sources of uncertainty in a flood model, particularly a large-scale flood model. The reality is that across most of the globe, knowledge about defences is extremely uncertain. In the US, we know where perhaps a third, 40% of levees are. In the UK, we have a pretty good idea, but not necessarily a concrete idea of their defence standards. And across most of the rest of the world, we have very little knowledge at all. And so we have to make assumptions. You can't just say, well, if we don't know exactly what's happening with the flood defence in this city, we're going to assume there are no defences there, because that's clearly a very core assumption to make, and one that will result in a model that floods every major city that isn't in the US or the UK or a few other specific areas every few years, because that's what rivers do in their natural state. And so the way we go about this is by looking at published information, studies that have been done, some simple models of key predictors of whether an area is likely to be defended. And then we use that to infer a defence standard and a defence coverage across the world based on urbanisation and things like that. And that goes into the model. And you can choose to view the model with those defence assumptions in place, or you can choose to view an undefended view. And we do attempt to as well say something about how those defences might fail. So rather than just assuming they're defended to a certain standard and then the defence disappears entirely, within Global 3, we effectively overtop the assumed defence standard within the defended view once you are exceeding that estimated defence standard. So there is an attempt to represent overtopping, which is the most common form of defence failure. I think just while I have the mic, Tim, if you don't mind, I might also just answer another question. We had a question from Scott Ferguson that also kind of touches on the idea of uncertainty. The question was, do the equations used with different hydraulic models from different suppliers really matter? Do the results vary that much, or is it down to the skill of the modeler? So there are sort of two answers to that question. In terms of, do the equations used with the different hydraulic models matter very much? If you are talking about the different forms of the shallow water equations, do you use a full complexity equation versus a simplified equation, but all within the shallow water family? I would say for the kinds of models we're talking about here, so for large scale models, actually the results will be very similar. And there's a whole wealth of publications that show you get very similar results. You know, if you're using an inertial model versus a full complexity model. Obviously, that would not be the case if you were doing some very specific types of models. Dam breach failures very close to the face of the dam, for example. But for large scale models, you want to use the simplest form of shallow water equation that you can, and in order to manage your computational cost. Where the answer is, it does really matter, is if you're comparing shallow water hydraulic models to GIS-based approaches, such as height above nearest drainage. In that situation, you see very significant differences between shallow water type models and I suppose you could call them GIS or planar approximation type results. And actually, we've just published a really nice paper with the Army Corps in the US, amongst others, that compared our own shallow water model implementation, which is based on the list flood family, with HECRAS, which is the well-known sort of standard engineering tool set that's used in the US, and a planar approach. And fundamentally, the two shallow water type models, so the list flood model and the HECRAS models, gave extremely similar answers. They both matched the observations kind of to within similar levels of error. Actually, they did slightly better than each other in different areas, but they were pretty similar in terms of overall skill, whereas the simple GIS-based approach was significantly worse. And so, yes, once you're using a shallow water type equation, then I think it makes slightly less difference in terms of the actual equations. The skill of the modeler is key. So, you know, solving where water goes when you know where downhill is and how much water should be in the domain is sort of a well-known piece of maths. The real skill is, how do you build everything around that? And that's what we focus all of our time on. And that's why these questions about terrain models and how you process them and how big should your rivers be and how do you calibrate this, those are the really important points. Over to you, Tim.
Thanks, Chris. There's been some great questions coming through. A couple of them we're going to save until the end, I think, but do keep them coming as we go. Well, so for all of you guys, beyond sounding very smart on webinars, how do we ensure that model users, the risk professionals that come to us, can have faith that these tools are going to be useful for their decision making?
Yeah, so in terms of the coastal stuff, the coastal boundary conditions, we put a lot of time into validating our methods and our results. All of this has been written up into a paper, which we are going to submit to a journal soon. It's in the final stages of review amongst the authors. So if you're interested in any of the coastal RFA stuff, then keep an eye out for the paper once it's published. And there's also a number of the Fathom team presenting on EGU this year. on a range of projects that we've all been working on, including all the methods or some of the methods that we used in Global 3. And there's also a host of papers which are in the works, again, validating and reviewing our methods that we've applied at Global 3. I think, Nat, did you want to add something else on this?
Yeah, so I was just going to say that I guess for users, for their point of view as well, we produced an extremely detailed methods document to accompany our Global 3 hazard. So it's over 120 pages long. It's been a huge effort to bring it all together, but it describes every modelling step in our framework kind of clearly, and sets out exactly kind of how we produced the flood hazard data, what observational and future climate data sets we've used and things, what assumptions we've made. And this document also includes some validation of our data against a selection of observed flood events. But this validation will continue to be ongoing. And as Tom said, there'll be kind of future validations to these that are included in future papers. But we're also really happy to provide customer support. So whether that's in the form of a meeting with our experts to run through the modelling framework itself, or asking specific questions about the models or the data itself, similar to the format that we've got here, what the models and the data can tell you and how they can and cannot be applied, then that's also something that we're really keen on, because obviously we want the data to be used kind of correctly, and we want it to be useful to people. So yeah, that's something we do.
Yeah, you mentioned EGU next week. I know that there are a number of people who are on as delegates to this call who'll be also heading to Vienna over the weekend for that, and it really is a showcase for us. A whole bunch of Fathom scientists going there, presenting posters and papers, both in work that's in progress and projects that have gone into our existing products. So do look us up if you're heading to Vienna. I can't guarantee that anyone will be carrying the hefty tome that is our Global Flood Map version 3 methodology document, but they can certainly put you in touch with with some of the digital versions of that. Moving on to more topical areas, there have been quite a number of recent articles published in both mainstream media and climate journals regarding the potential, should we say, misuse or perhaps overuse of climate model data for projections of risk to assets in the future. Some of these have created some quite heated debate just over the last week or two. What are your views on this? Chris, could I ask you to lead on that question?
Yeah, this is a juicy one. I like this question. So this is really topical, and it's really, really important, I think. And it's been great to see some of the questions that those of us who work in this field sort of ask ourselves every day, finding their way into the mainstream media. I guess the old adage that all models are wrong, but some models are useful is a really good place to start with this discussion. Climate models were not designed to inform us about local, transient, extreme weather phenomena. That's not what climate is. It's kind of like the opposite end of the scale from climate. They were designed to tell us about large-scale, long-term averages. And yet, when we're looking at risk, we are typically looking at asset scales, so very small spatial scales, and we're looking at extreme events. And therefore, the amount that we can infer from climate models about how such extreme weather events are going to change or may change into the future is an extremely active area of research. And we talked about this a little bit already, Nat in particular. There are some areas where the models agree more than others. We have a reasonable degree of confidence, and the IPCC has made this very clear, obviously, lately, in terms of what's happening with sea level rise. And actually, sea level rise itself is certainly towards the end of the century, relatively unaffected by policy choices. It's pretty much baked in, and we know what's going to happen there. We're also getting increasing confidence in terms of surface water changes due to rainfall as climate models increase in resolution and get better at representing the physical processes that drive extreme rainfall. The changes that we see coming out of those models in terms of their projected changes to extreme rainfall get closer and closer to the kind of Clausius-Clapeyron physical relationship that we'd expect to see. And so our confidence that, yeah, a warmer atmosphere is going to hold more moisture, and therefore in all but the very driest parts of the world, we're expecting to see that result in more extreme rainfall. That's looking increasingly robust. But when it comes to fluvial changes, those are hugely uncertain. They're uncertain spatially, they're also uncertain in terms of event scale. So it may be that we see different types of change as you move through the frequency space. All of this, I guess, goes to say that this is really complex, and there's a lot of uncertainty and there's a lot of discourse, and that means it's really important that whichever tools you choose to look at this question with, you understand the choices that the modeling team are making. So transparency of methodology, I think, is hugely important here. Climate models are the best tools that we have to use. So you can't pretend that this isn't a problem or say because it's so difficult we're not going to do anything at all. It's just really important that you understand the choices that are being made and how the tools are being used. And I think this is really what's being reflected in the commentaries that we're seeing. There is a strong push against any kind of black boxing of models, because that's a problem for the user, because the user doesn't really understand exactly which assumptions have been made, and therefore they can't mediate their use of the data based on the modeling decisions. So that's my view.
Yeah, I might just come in quickly. So just to drill down a bit more into Chris's point that climate models are designed to simulate climate rather than kind of extreme local events. Convective storms, for an example, you would need a climate model with a horizontal resolution of a couple of kilometers to really start resolving and properly representing these types of extreme events, and they're obviously important in many regions for extreme rainfall and for flooding. And we're starting to see these sort of very high resolution convective permitting models being developed and being run, but only for small territories, because obviously if you go to that really high resolution, then that requires a huge amount more computing power. So it means the spatial area that you can cover, and also the number of years and the number of ensemble members that you can produce are a lot smaller. You have to, it's this kind of age-old toss-up between whether you want ensembles of models that give you sort of many, many years worth of data, which include the kind of really rare extreme events that we're interested in for flooding, or if you want this high resolution kind of models which are able to more realistically represent the kind of some of the events that cause extreme flooding, but are very computation expensive. So you can only, produce several decades worth of data and perhaps only one or two ensemble members. So there's kind of pros and cons to both approaches. And I guess also linking back to one of the points that Scott mentioned in his question about how important is the skill of the modeler. So Erica Thompson, who's based at UCL, and a number of others have discussed in the last few years the importance of the use of expert judgment in the interpretation of model data and how it can and should be applied in the real world. So we've already discussed how all of these different models have biases. They use certain assumptions and subjective decisions in their construction, in their operation, and then so they have all these inherent uncertainties. And so it's really important, I think, that these climate and flood models and the results that they produce are used in combination with expert judgment, as this is what really provides users with an awareness and an understanding of the models and what their limitations are, and then also how they can and should be applied and what they can and can't tell you. So rather than having, just taking climate data, if you have no experience with climate modeling, you might think that you can use the climate data in a certain way, but that's not necessarily, you know, a valid use for that climate data. You kind of need this larger understanding of climate models, how they're constructed, how they can and should be used in order to kind of effectively use the data. And then just quickly around uncertainties as well, like I know a lot of kind of policymakers, excuse me, and organizations may prefer to kind of use ignore uncertainty in kind of future projections and just use a single number, you know, in SSP 58.5 2050, this is the change we're going to see, just a single view. But actually, we've talked about all the uncertainties in almost every stage of the modelling framework, and from the models to the observations to the emissions scenarios. And so it's not just as simple as a single answer, and that's why we have such a big focus on trying to understand and capture some of these uncertainties in our data, to give kind of users a more complete view of how the flood hazard in different regions might change in the future and what that range might be. And so I think it is starting to be more recognised in industries that this uncertainty is essential to consider, but it's hopefully, yeah, something that will be continue to be and increasingly used in the future when assessing changes in future risk.
Thanks. I think it's a debate that's going to run and run and only get more possibly heated in the coming months. Conscious of time, we have a couple of questions from the audience, and I think the first of those that we're going to answer is from Steve. Thanks, Steve. Your question is: you said silent floods models were of necessity built from thin data. Has Fathom ever created data-thin UK models and compared them to data-rich UK models to compare the uncertainty from Thailand models? If so, what did you learn about the value of precise data? Who'd like to take that?
Yeah, I've nominated myself for this one because it's an interesting question, and yes, it is something that we've done both in the UK and in the US. So basically, to compare the outputs from the modelling framework, if we don't allow them to use any of the local terrain or terrain data from the UK and the US, and if we don't restrict the regionalisation of boundary conditions to data just from those territories. So effectively, if we build the model just using the kind of globally pooled data over those territories versus if we build the model using the same framework but allowing it to really only use the regional data. And you do see some differences. The overwhelming differences come from the terrain data. I guess without getting into the weeds too much, because we don't have time, the way in which we typically approach all kinds of boundary condition in our modelling frameworks is by regionalisation. We recognise that even in a data-rich area, you don't have gauges everywhere, be they rainfall gauges or coastal gauges or fluvial gauges. So you have to do a degree of regionalisation, substitution of time for space in effect. And as a result of that, actually, the difference between a regionalised model in the UK or the US that just uses UK or US model versus a global regionalised model for boundary conditions, actually the differences there are quite modest. But the terrain data is killer. And prior to what we were able to do with Copernicus DEM, which resulted in a product that we've released called FabDEM, the differences were pretty significant, and they vary with scale, so they were more significant on small channels than on large channels. So actually the global representation of a flood wave going down the Mississippi River was pretty similar between a regional US model and the global model, even using SRTM based elevation data. But that changed pretty significantly as you moved into smaller catchments. What's really reassuring is that gap has definitely diminished significantly over the last 5 or 6 years, and has taken a huge step towards closure with the new generation of data, of terrain data that we can create based on the Copernicus DEM and others. So it's encouraging because it shows us that our ability to model with skill everywhere is improving, and there's no signs of that that convergence of model skills from slowing anytime soon, I don't think.
Thanks, Chris. I think we have we have enough time for one last question. Thank you, Holger. The question is, Regarding flood event response analytics, which is quite important for the insurance sector, do you provide footprints in the aftermath of an event? And if so, how do you derive them and which flood types are covered? If you'd like to take that.
I can pick that up, I guess, as well. So we have done it and do it at the moment on an ad hoc basis, dependent on whether or not we have particular clients or partners who need information about that event. We also do it operationally as part of a UK government aid project, which focuses on cyclone response in Southern Africa and the Indian Ocean Basin. And that's as part of a consortia of different universities and ourselves, as well as others. And so, depending on the event, ultimately it depends on which types of flood we cover. So we're able to do them for surface water flooding, we're able to do them for fluvial responses, we're able to do them for storm surge type responses. The data that we use, again, it depends on where you are in the world. If you're in the US and you're looking at a response to a hurricane, you typically have pretty good information to work with. You can use NOAA forecasts of the storm track and surge to drive the models, and you can use pretty near real-time gauge observations for rivers and rainfall to then generate footprints quite quickly. We are working on a global live forecasting system as well, and that is something that we're actively working on at the moment. So I guess what I'm going to say there is watch this space on that one.
Thanks, Chris. We're nearing the end of the session. We've covered a lot of ground. Thanks, guys. Thanks to our panelists, Nat, Chris, and Tom, and to you, the audience, for your questions and for contributing to the dialogue. In summary, I hope we've given you a good overview of pertinent considerations in flood and climate modelling. In future, when asking these or similar questions, whether to Fathom or of other model builders, you ought to be entitled to expect, firstly, clear, unambiguous answers backed up by research, published in recognised academic journals, and/or clear method statements. Secondly, you are entitled to a clear understanding of the limitations of the data and the ways in which it can be reliably and credibly used. And more generally, you should expect to be able to push back comfortably against hand-wavy reliance on vague, it's all in the AI and the ML, or black box explanations. I hope the webinar has been of value to you. If you had any questions that the team didn't cover, that you have the opportunity to ask them at other events, please do get in touch so we can continue the conversation. Likewise, if you have any topics that you'd like to see us cover in future webinars or specific webinars, or even just to rerun this session in a different area of the science or the business of flood modelling, please do let us know. As always, you can follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter. You can email us. You can check out our website and you can register for our newsletter. The links are in the chat, as well as receive updates on when and where you can meet us on the conference and exhibition circuit this year. We're attending the Global Association of Research of Risk Professionals conference in just a few weeks in New York. We're always at the Instec insurance events in London, so do seek us out. This webinar has been recorded and you will receive a link to that in our follow-up email, so please do share that with your colleagues and friends. Finally, thank you everybody, and look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you, folks.
Thanks all.
Cheers, everyone.